Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 130. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. Swamp Thing has been poisoned. He has become toxic after fighting a toxic monster who was actually all the way in New Jersey, and it was hurting the Greens so bad that Swamp Thing was called to it from Louisiana. And Swamp Thing built himself a double so that he could leave it behind because he had just promised Abby that he would never leave her again to fight something for the Greens. So he leaves this double, he went up there, he fought a monster, he gets toxic. And in the last issue, we saw him kind of tripping out from this toxicness. And because of that, we kind of got like a recap of all of his history with his bad guys from the 70s and the Alan Moore run and everything. So it was kind of like a catch-up issue for any new readers who were jumping on because it was the first officially branded Vertigo title. And Vertigo, in case you don't know, is like the imprint of DC where all the cool comics were. You had Hellblazer, you had Sandman. Basically, it was all the dark characters in the DC universe. They were under the Vertigo imprint, and they were pretty freaking awesome. So in the meantime, at the Swamp household, the doppelganger is doing a really good job pretending to be Alec. So good, in fact, that Tefé likes him being the dad because he's paying more attention to her. And Abby also likes him because he's paying more attention to her in other ways, meaning they've been making lots of love. They've been really connecting with one another, and it seems like Abby's really happy, which is super messed up because she thinks it's Alex. She thinks that their marriage is going great. And that is where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 130, we got the cover. We see there is a Swamp Thing body that looks like it's been dissolved into the ground. We can see like the marks where it was, or at least part of it is, like where his body was splayed out. And on top of him, we see Tefé is dancing and playing with those little daisy flower people that she made. And they're kind of doing it on top of Swamp Thing's decayed body. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMolder. And I believe the last shot we saw of Swamp Thing from the last issue was him passed out on the ground face down. And we pick up right there, somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania. We see he is in some sort of cow pasture, and he is face down. His body seems to have dissolved somewhat, and now there are mushrooms growing from it. And we also see on this page, which is kind of unusual, the title of this issue, which is Homesick. And it just so happens that there's a couple of hippies walking by this cow pasture, and they see these mushrooms growing out of what they think is the ground, but it's actually Swamp Thing's decaying and toxic body. And one of them bends down and picks up one of the mushrooms, and he examines it, and he says, "I've never seen a shroom quite like this before. Trippy." And then his hippie friend responds, "Me neither, Spurhawk. You think it might be poisonous?" And Spurhawk replies, "Nah, I know toadstools when I see them. And this ain't one of them, believe me." And Spurhawk's friend says, "You think we can get off on it?" And Spurhawk answers, "Only one way to find out." And in one gulp, he eats the whole mushroom. And it's kind of funny. His friend seems a lot more worried than him because he says, "Spurhawk, don't." And as Spurhawk finishes the mushroom, he kind of laughs and he says, "Chill out, man. You're worse than my mom. How do you expect to experience life at its fullest if you're afraid to take risks?" And he is definitely taking a risk because in the next panel, we see all of a sudden he's kind of grasping at his neck because it's like he's choking. And then in front of his friend, Spurhawk's body dissolves completely. And this actually kind of reminds me of that issue, or a couple issues, I think, during the Alan Moore run with the homeless guy that is from Pennsylvania as well. And he has toxic waste or radiation with him. And he gives a drink of that toxic waste to a guy that's with him. And that guy dissolves just like Spurhawk here. And the funny thing is, his friend is watching this, and unlike all of us, I think, if you saw someone literally melting in front of your eyes like the bad guy in Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, it would freak you out pretty good. But this guy watches his friend melt in front of his eyes until there's only a pile of bones and a bunch of gross liquid underneath them, and then he runs away. And as he does, we see Swamp Thing wake up, and he thinks to himself as he pushes himself from the ground, "Where am I?" And he looks around and he sees the cows, and his thoughts continue. "This isn't South America. The last thing I remember, I was with the Parliament. They accused me of failing them, of failing the Green. They told me I had to choose between my family and the green, and I refused. Was it real, or was it simply another hallucination? So slowly, Swamp Thing begins to stand up, and as he begins to shamble down again towards Louisiana, he thinks, I'll worry about that later. The important thing is to get home. Home is all that matters. Then we cut to his home in Terrebonne Parish, and we see Abby is at home making something on the stove, and Lady Jane walks up to her and says, Madam, and Abby turns around and says, Yes, Lady Jane? And Lady Jane replies, I think there is something I should tell you. And Abby asks, What is it? And then before Lady Jane can say anything, because we know she's been feeling conflicted about the whole Swamp Thing doppelganger living with Abby right now and everything that they've been doing at night and stuff, and she's uncomfortable with that. So she was probably going to tell on Swamp Thing right here, but before she can do that, all of a sudden, the doppelganger Swamp Thing comes out of nowhere, and he surprises Abby with flowers, and he says, Happy anniversary. And Abby is super happy, and she says, You remembered. Alec, you're the best husband a woman could hope for. And then she jumps into the double's arms and gives him a big hug, and then she remembers that Lady Jane was going to say something to her, and she turns to Lady Jane and says, Oh, I'm sorry, lady. What was it you wanted to tell me? And then we get some really cool panels where Lady Jane just stares at the doppelganger, and the doppelganger stares back at her, and it looks like he's saying, You better not say anything. But he's just saying that with his eyes, and so Lady Jane takes that advice and doesn't say anything. She turns around and says, Nothing important. Congratulations on your anniversary. Then we cut back to Swamp Thing in Pennsylvania, and I know I've been saying that his body's been decomposing almost every issue for the last couple issues, but maybe it's like regenerating or something every now and then, because it's like his body's regenerating and then he dissolves and then he comes back and then he's got more sores and stuff on him, and the way his body looks is kind of back and forth depending on when we catch him. So as he walks, he's thinking, How long have I been wandering this countryside? Days? Weeks? Months? I don't dare allow myself to rest. The last time I came dangerously close to taking permanent root. In my condition, I could do serious damage to the water table of the surrounding area, not to mention its ecosystem. Then from behind Swamp Thing, someone says, You managed to make a real cock-up of it this time, didn't you, Bog God? And when Swamp Thing turns to see who spoke, he sees it is in fact John Constantine. So Swamp Thing looks at John and he says, I never thought I would be glad to see you. And John looks at him as he takes a puff of his cigarette and says, It seems like I'm always turning up in the nick of time to save your mossy butt, don't it? Let me tell you, mate, I'm getting bloody sick and tired of it. But what chafes my ass is how high and mighty you act whenever I show up. Like you're too bloody good to be associated with the likes of me. Mr. Friggin' Champion of the Green, huh? If it weren't for me, you'd never have learned of the Parliament of the Trees in the first place. And because Swamp Thing is in a bit of a pickle here, he's dissolving and rotting and everything, and he needs to get home. He swallows his pride a bit, and he says, Constantine, I realize I have been unfair to you in the past, but I need your help. And John replies, Like that time you needed my help making the beast with two backs, huh? You couldn't have done that without old Johnny boy. If you don't remember, he's talking about the Rick Veitch run when Swamp Thing possessed John's body without his permission, I should say. And this was also they could use John's body to have a child, so that's how Tefé came about. Then John says, Tell me, Bog God, don't you ever wonder what happens back at the ranch while you're off on your little adventures? I mean, a steady diet of roots and tubers can get dull after a while. Maybe the missus fancies a bit of the old man thing every now and then, huh? And we see the John that tauntingly says this is actually one of Swamp Thing's hallucinations that was happening in the last issue. So this John isn't really there. He is now blue, and we see that there's a naked Abby crawling all over him, as he said this last statement about Abby possibly cheating on him. And Swamp Thing realizes that this is just a fake John Constantine and not the real one. So he swipes at the air, and that makes the naked Abby and John Constantine dissolve. And as they do, they begin to laugh at him, and he yells out, Shut up! Shut up! And he falls down to the ground, clutching his head. Then we cut to the Sunderland corporate headquarters in Washington, D.C., and we see Dr. Polygon is sitting in his laboratory, and his phone is saying to him, Miss Sunderland on line 1, Dr. Polygon. And Dr. Polygon says to the speakerphone, Miss Sunderland, to what do I owe the pleasure? And Connie Sunderland replies, I was curious as to how things were progressing on your project, Doctor. And as Dr. Polygon answers, he's looking at a bunch of text in books, and they look like they have like occultic and math signs and stuff in them. And then he's inputting stuff on the computer. And as he does this, he says, things are progressing quite nicely, thanks to the resources you've placed at my disposal. There are several narrow-minded purists, that helmeted idiot Dr. Fate for one, who would believe that modern technology has no place in the metaphysical and supernatural spheres. I'll show them. I'll prove they're nothing more than primitive shamans daubed in mud and body paint. And Connie replies, that's all very well and good, Doctor, but I want results. You can revenge yourself against your detractors on your own time. Is that clear? And Dr. Polygon kind of looks angry as she says this, and he replies, perfectly. You needn't worry, Miss Sunderland. You'll have the results you desire. I promise you that. And Connie responds, you better be telling me the truth, Polygon. If it turns out you've been jerking me around, you're going to end up dog food. And we don't get like an audible click from the speakerphone, but they are done talking. And Polygon is definitely not having fun working for Connie. He puts his head in his hands and leans forward and sighs to himself as he says, employers, they are all the same. When will they learn you can't rush these things? Even with the finest computer technology on hand, some things simply take time. And we see him reach for some kind of special dagger in the room. And it's kind of funny because we get a full page splash of him standing now, and he's got the knife in his hand, and we see on the other side of the room that we couldn't see before because we were facing him at his desk, which looked just like a regular office. Behind him, the second half of his office is basically a medieval dungeon. There is a man hanging from a hook in the ceiling, and there's a bunch of bones and stuff piled up in the corners. And the man who's hanging is still alive, and below him is a pentagram on the ground with candles lit on each of the points. And Dr. Polygon says to the hanging man, and I'll admit, sometimes the old ways are the best. Then we come back to Swamp Thing, and apparently it's been some time because now it says he is somewhere in southeast Kentucky. So he's definitely making his way south. He still looks pretty bad, and he's thinking to himself, home, I've got to get home, where my love waits for me. Then from behind Swamp Thing, someone yells out, Daddy! And Swamp Thing immediately knows who that is, even before he turns, and he yells out, Tefé! And as he turns, he sees Tefé is running from a giant bear, and he yells out, Tefé, watch out! And Swamp Thing is actually able to reach the bear before it grabs Tefé, and he begins to wrestle with it. And we see Tefé behind him sucking her thumb as she watches this fight. And it doesn't last that long because Swamp Thing just reaches up and snaps the bear's neck. Then he picks Tefé up and he says, it's all right, baby. The bad bear can't hurt you anymore. And then Tefé starts crying and she won't stop. And Swamp Thing says to her, Tefé, you can stop crying. Nothing is going to harm you. Daddy's here. But she won't stop crying, and she keeps yelling daddy at him. And then as we turn the page, we see that Swamp Thing is actually holding a different baby. It's not Tefé, it's in fact an African-American baby that was walking in the swamps, and she is saying, I want my daddy. So Swamp Thing has had another hallucination, but this time there was actually something really there, and it was just a different child. Then Swamp Thing hears someone yell out, you put my young'un down right this second, you whatever the hell you are. Let her go or I'll blow you to kingdom come, I swear. And as Swamp Thing turns around, he sees the father, and the father has a shotgun pointing at Swamp Thing. And we also see that there is a dead dog that looks like its neck has been broken in front of Swamp Thing as well. And the father yells out, I saw what you did to poor old Cooter there, and I'll be damned if you're going to harm a hair on my little girl. And then Swamp Thing now realizes what happened, and he says to the man, I meant no harm. And then he drops the little girl, and the dad doesn't really seem to care that the little girl is safe now. He still wants to take out this monster, so he shoots Swamp Thing with his shotgun in the torso, and Swamp Thing's whole middle section is blown out except his spine. And then he takes his little girl and he runs away, and Swamp Thing falls to his knees, and he assesses the damage to his abdomen, and he thinks to himself, home. Then we cut to the Swamp Thing house, and it is later that night. And as we cut inside, we see Abby and Swamp Thing are in bed, and they're both naked, and Abby is saying, that was magnificent. So they've obviously just got done making love, and once again, we know that the doppelganger is definitely a skilled lover. So a very satisfied Abby looks at the double Swamp Thing and says, Despite the problems and traumas we've undergone over the years, I'd do it all over again in a minute. It's been such a long, strange journey, but it was worth it since it led to me being here with you at this very moment. And then the doppelganger looks at Abby and says, I love you, Abby. I would rather die than give you up. Then he embraces her and they begin to make love again. Then we cut to somewhere near the Kentucky-Tennessee state line, and we see Swamp Thing with his injured body that's been shot, and it's nighttime for him here as well, so this is probably the exact same time that his doppelganger is making love to Abby. He's walking, and he's thinking, I have to get home. I have been gone too long. There is no telling what might happen while I'm away. Arcane is still out there, somewhere, biding his time like a spider, crouching in a web, waiting to strike. I promised Abby I wouldn't leave her and the baby unprotected. If anything has happened to them, I'll never forgive myself. And then once again, this seems to be a motif in this issue. Someone calls out from behind Swamp Thing, Holland. And as Swamp Thing turns, he sees the evil Anton Arcane, and Anton says, Did you miss me? But once again, this is just another vision, and what actually is looking at him is a giant semi-truck because Swamp Thing has walked out into the middle of the road, and what were the eyes of Anton were actually the headlights of this truck, and this truck is barreling towards him and it's honking. But before we see what happens there, we cut to Metairie, Louisiana, which is the home of Representative Barron, who is the racist Republican candidate for governor, who's been trying to get back at Swamp Thing for messing up his election campaign. So we see Representative Barron on the phone with Child Protective Services again, and he's saying, Hello, Miss Johnson. This is Representative Barron again. Do you remember the case I told you about? Yes, the one involving the unfit mother. And then he looks down at his desk and we see the photos that he was taking last time of Abby and Chester's house, and they're hugging each other. And it was just a simple friendship hug, but it kind of looked more intimate. And that's exactly what Barron wanted. There's also other photos of her walking with the owner of JoJo's Bar and Chester down the street. And she's got her hand on each of their waists, and it kind of looks like maybe they're some kind of throuple or something. And he's going to use these pictures as evidence to give to Child Protective Services to try to get Tefé taken away from Abby and Swamp Thing. And Barron continues, Well, I happen to have obtained certain photos that might prove helpful. I'll send them to your office first thing this morning. No, don't thank me, ma'am. I feel it is my duty to make sure this child is given the parenting she deserves. Then we cut back to the Swamp Thing house, and I guess it's maybe later that night because what we just saw was during the day, and before that it was at nighttime, so it must be the evening of the following night. And we see Tefé is sleeping in her crib, and in her room, we see all the little daisy people that Tefé has created, and it looks like they've all created some kind of tribe, and there's one in the center that has a spear, and it's yelling out, la, 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 and all the others are sitting around listening to it, and there's even some that bring him a tribute, I think, of a dead rat. So it seems that this is the leader of the flower people. And it seems like the leader is giving a very motivating speech to all the flower people around him, and I think I've said it before, but all they say is la, 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 la. So, like, the speech is just him saying la a bunch, and then the others reply la, 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 la. So as the speech is coming to an end, we can tell it's getting more and more intense, and it's coming to its climax. And all of a sudden, the leader is interrupted by someone saying la. And as he turns, we see another flower warrior who looks much taller than the others, and he seems to be challenging the current leader. So he's standing with his spear in his hand, and he says, la, la. Then the current leader yells out, la, 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 and then charges at the challenger. And then there's a big epic daisy fight, which you could imagine is pretty funny looking because it's two flowers trying to murder each other with handmade spears. But the challenger is the one who ends victorious, and he totally kills the current leader. So he raises his spear in victory, and all the other flowers chant, la, 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 la. Then we cut to the next day where we see somewhere in Tennessee, where we see Swamp Thing is actually crawling on the ground, pulling himself forward with his hands because the whole lower half of his body has dissolved. And he's thinking to himself, home, I have to go home. It's no use. I can't go on. I'm too weak. And just as he's about to pass out, he says, Abby. And I don't know how long he was passed out, but we do see a human foot next to him in the next panel, so probably not too long. And Swamp Thing actually hears the human steps next to him, and he says, "Please don't be afraid. I need help. Please." And he looks up and he reaches out, and as we turn the page, we see it's not just one person standing over him. It's a bunch of different people, and they don't look human. They look more like elves or some kind of night creatures. Because they're humanoid, but they have like cat eyes and pointy ears. And they definitely look like they're locals from the swamp. They're wearing the same stuff that the Cajuns usually wear. But we'll have to find out more about these people in the next issue because this one is over. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.